Alright, everybody, welcome to AP Psych. My name is Mr. Vogel, and I will be your instructor for this course this year. Today, we're going to start Unit 1, and we're briefly just going to look at the intro and history of psychology, what it is. We will get into the perspectives more so when you guys actually come to class here in a couple weeks. So, before we get started, in your notes, I want you to just write down 5 simple adjectives that you think describe a typical scientist. I'll give you guys about 30 seconds to do that. Okay, and now I want you to write down 5 adjectives that describe a typical psychologist in your words. I'll give you another 30 seconds. Okay, let's look at some possible answers that you maybe wrote. So for a scientist, some traditional answers I usually give would be methodical, analytical, resourceful, intelligent, and thorough. And then for a psychologist, here are some terms, some adjectives I often get would be accepting, caring, genuine, personable, and attentive. Okay, now what we'll soon find out as we study this course in more detail is that one, psychology and a psychologist has a scientific background. Some would argue, if you went to talk to maybe some of the science teachers here at ICS, they would argue that psychology is not a science, and we see clearly that it is because the scientific method is used time in and time out in order for psychologists to make research discoveries. Okay. What you'll also find out is that psychologists are not necessarily genuine, personable, caring, or accepting either. Okay, we'll look at some psychologists like Dr. John Money on the theory of gender neutrality, and you will see very much that he was not someone who was caring or accepting. Okay, and then there are other psychologists like Harry Harlow and his studies on infant attachment. We see here too that there's a lot of ethical issues in Harry Harlow's experiments on the study of attachment. So these typical answers don't completely define psychology, and you're going to see that in more detail. Okay, let's look at what psychology actually is. And from the textbook, it says that it is the scientific study of behavioral and mental processes. And this applies to both humans and animals, and is founded on the scientific method. So the 2 words I underlined there, it's important that you understand each of them apply to the scientific study of psychology. Psychology is not only mental, but it's also behavioral. So from a behavioral process, we're looking at everything that is objective, everything that is observable behavior. Okay, so eating, smiling, playing sports, these are observable behaviors that we can measure through objective data. Mental processes are subjective. They're things that we can't measure through strictly observation. Okay, they're feelings, sensation, perceptions, thoughts, dreams. We can't measure those by observing. Okay, so that would include the mental processes of psychology. Next, let's look at the goals of psych, and there are 4 key ones that we're going to discuss. The first is to describe behavior and mental processes. This helps us classify and measure these 2 things. And then the second would be to explain behavior and mental processes. This is going to tell us why a current behavior or a mental process is occurring. The third is to predict behavior and mental processes. This is going to help us see possible future occurrences of behaviors and mental processes. And then the last is prevention or promotion. Okay, so we want to apply principles and knowledge as we've measured and classified them and understood and been able to understand why and how these behaviors and mental processes are occurring, so that we can then prevent undesirable or promote desirable behaviors or mental processes towards our ultimate goal. Okay. Again, little short quiz. What is the definition of psychology? Scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Good job if you got that. Okay. I want to briefly look at some of the psychological roots, in particular 4 men: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and John Locke. So these 4 men really helped develop psychology into what it is today. And it goes all the way back to 399 BC when you have Socrates. And Socrates is the teacher of Plato, and he comes up with this thing called the Socratic method, right? Which basically just challenges conventional thinking about things like virtues and courage and justice. And he believes that Socrates believes that the mind was actually separate from the body, and that it continued to exist after death. Plato then takes his findings and his philosophies and kind of furthers his study and focuses on explaining the reality through ideas, And so he thinks that everything that is reality is beyond tangible. And if you want to look at more detail on that, which you guys have probably actually already studied this in your philosophy classes, but it's looking at the allegory of the cave. And he talks about the allegory of the cave and how this actually later led to the development of cognitive psychology and mental processes. Then Aristotle comes along, and he's a student of Plato, but he actually rebels against Plato's and Socrates' philosophy that some ideas are inborn. And he believes that reality can only be tangible. And this is his quote: "There is nothing in the intellect that wasn't first in the senses." And so he basically here is suggesting that the soul is not separable from the body, and that knowledge, or this sense of idea, it's grown from experience. Okay? And many, many, many years later, Locke comes along, and he's known as the father of liberalism, and he promotes this word tabula rasa, which that is the Latin origin of our word that we have today, which is just called the blank state. Okay, in the sense that when we're born, we have a blank state, a tabula rasa. Okay, and this will then later lead to his development of empiricism, which is a view that knowledge originates in our experiences and our observations through experimentation of living life. So this is kind of his life work, the study of empiricism. So what is empiricism? There's your definition. It's a view that knowledge originates in experience. Strongly believed that science should rely on observation and experimentation. Okay, so after we have the prehistoric history of psychology, we go into the birth of psychology through Wilhelm Wundt. Right, he's known as the father of psychology, and he was the first to actually study consciousness, human consciousness, in the lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879 with his student Edward Titchener. Right, they would be looking at the elements or the atoms of the mind by conducting these experiments on sensation, emotion, and perception. So he is known as the father of psychology who used this term at the bottom. You see introspection. Introspection is when we look inward to discover our own internal processes, aka why do you feel what you feel? Why do you perceive what you perceive? Why do you sense what you sense? And this would later lead to the foundation of structuralism. And you could even say functionalism, because he is the first to take human consciousness and try to study it in a lab. Edward Titchener, his student, would then further Wilhelm Wundt's research by continuing this process of introspection. Again, as I said, it's when we're looking inward into oneself. And so he used introspection to develop structuralism, which was another early school of psychology that explored the elemental structure of the human mind and consciousness. So these, both structuralism and introspection, were seen as very unreliable because reports of the people that they were experimenting on varied from person to person, and they just weren't reliable. And it was also difficult to use on children, impossible to use on animals, and other complex topics like mental disorders. So while it was very important to the beginnings of psychology, today it's quite unreliable. The answer is E.B. Titchener. All right. Last person I want to look at today is William James. All right, he's the LeBron James of psychology. And he is the first American psychologist. Right, also the author of Principles of Psychology, first textbook for the field of psychology, and he is the founder of what's known as functionalism. So he rejects the introspective method, and he rejects structuralism. And instead of focusing so much on what, he focuses more so on how, the function of the brain works in our consciousness. So functionalism is exactly how it sounds. It's the goal of studying the function of the brain. So an example of this, in other words, would be instead of looking at how fear makes us feel, which is what structuralism would study, functionalism would look at how that fear enables us to adapt, survive, and flourish. You're looking at the purpose behind the fear, not just looking at what fear is and what does it do to us in our conscious experiences. You want to know how that fear enables us. Okay, don't get these confused on your test. Structuralism came from Wilhelm Wundt and Titchener, and it sought to identify what the structure of the mind is, while functionalism sought to identify how the mind and consciousness work. Okay, they're very different. Now, later on, you also had another type of psychology that developed, and this is called Gestalt psychology. Okay, it developed in Germany by Wertheimer, Kafka, and Kohler, who founded this in revolt against Wundt's study of introspection and structuralism. And so, while structuralists look at these individual elements to analyze separately in consciousness, Gestalt psychologists focus more on constructing a perceptual whole. Okay, Gestalt. It's all about understanding the whole. So an example of this would be, um, let's say you're listening to a song, your favorite song. Okay, individually, each note that you listen to in that song doesn't have much meaning, right? An individual note out of that song does not give you perception of this is my favorite song. Okay, but when you take each note, each rhythm, each chorus, each verse, and you combine all those together, you have a perceptual whole, and it makes a tune. So combining all of these elements creates something that really didn't exist before. It creates a whole, different from structuralists who look at all of these separate parts of our function and our consciousness. Gestalt psychology wants to emphasize on how to integrate everything, all of that information that we're experiencing in our emotions and our perceptions and our sensations, and make a meaningful whole of our psychology. All right, that's all I want to talk with you guys about today. And we will continue this unit when I see you next class. Again, we'll have our first test, or I should say, not test, I should say, we'll have our first quiz when you guys come in to class for the first day. Okay, so not day 0, but we'll have our actual quiz on day 1 when I see you guys. All right, enjoy the rest of your break, and we'll see you soon.